The Nexus Prime Academy stood like a monument to interspecies cooperation, which was rather ironic considering most of its students spent their time learning increasingly creative ways to dismember each other. Located on the neutral moon of Sanctum 7, the Academy boasted the finest military training facilities in 3-star systems, complete with gravity adjusters, atmospheric processors, and enough safety equipment to make a Terran insurance adjuster weep with joy. Of course, when your student body includes species that can phase through solid matter, manipulate crystalline structures with their minds, and project energy beams from their fingertips, safety becomes a relative concept. The Academy's designers had thoughtfully installed energy dampeners, kinetic barriers, and emergency medical stations every 50 meters. They had not, however, anticipated enrolling a human. Commander Vexthul clicked his mandibles in what passed for contemplation among his kind, as he reviewed the latest incident reports. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the office's artificial lighting, and his compound eyes reflected the holographic displays showing training facility damage assessments. 3 sparring mats completely destroyed, 2 gravity generators offline, and 1 very confused maintenance crew trying to figure out how a punching bag had ended up embedded in a reinforced wall. "Explain to me again," he buzzed to his aide, Lieutenant Quirix, "how a single first-year student managed to cause more property damage in 1 semester than the previous graduating class combined." Quek's antennae twitched nervously. "Well, sir, the human doesn't seem to understand the concept of restraint during training exercises. The human has a name, Lieutenant. Jenna Morrison, sir, though the other students have taken to calling her Tank." Vexthul's mandibles clicked faster, a sure sign of mounting irritation. "And why, pray tell, do they call her that?" "Because she moves like one, sir, and has roughly the same stopping power." The commander pulled up Morrison's file, watching her holographic image rotate slowly above his desk. She appeared deceptively ordinary for a Deathworlder. Average height by human standards, stocky build, short cropped auburn hair, and the kind of casual smile that suggested she found the universe mildly amusing. Her psychological profile indicated high intelligence, adaptability, and what the Terran military euphemistically called aggressive problem-solving tendencies. "Her test scores are impressive," Vexthul admitted grudgingly. "Top 5% in tactical analysis, mechanical aptitude through the ceiling, and her linguistic adaptation is remarkable. She's already fluent in Standard Galactic and picking up Valerian Highspeak." "Yes, sir. The Valerians find that particularly offensive." "Of course they do." The commander closed the file with a gesture. "Schedule a meeting with Morrison. I want to understand what we're dealing with before she accidentally levels the entire complex." Meanwhile, in Training Complex 7, Jenna Morrison was having what she considered a perfectly normal workout session. The other students, huddled safely behind reinforced barriers, might have disagreed. She'd started with basic calisthenics, push-ups, sit-ups, jumping jacks, the kind of routine that would barely qualify as a warm-up back home. Unfortunately, nobody had bothered to explain to the facility's sensors that human exercise patterns weren't meant to trigger emergency protocols. "Warning, seismic activity detected in Training Complex 7, announced the facility's AI in its maddeningly calm voice. "Initiating structural integrity scan." Jenna paused mid-burpee, sweat beading on her forehead despite the climate control. "It's just me, Nexus, doing human things." Clarification requested. "Are human things a form of tectonic warfare?" "Only on Tuesdays." She resumed her workout, blissfully unaware that her routine was being broadcast live to the Academy's Xenobiology department as a case study in Deathworlder physiology. Professor Lithara, a willowy Zephyrian with the ability to phase shift through solid matter, watched in fascination as Jenna completed her 3rd set of pull-ups on a bar rated for twice her body weight. "Remarkable," the professor murmured to her research assistant. "Notice how she maintains perfect form even as the gravitational resistance increases. Most species would struggle to adapt to the variable G training environment." "Professor," the assistant ventured, "shouldn't we inform her that the gravity in her section is set to 1.3 standard? That's the advanced level." "Good point. Nexus, what gravity setting is Morrison currently training under?" "Current gravitational constant in Training Complex 7, 1.7 standard." Lithara's phase-shifted form flickered with surprise. "That's the elite level setting. How long has she been training under those conditions?" "Since her arrival 6 weeks ago." The human requested something closer to home. The professor made a note to add this to her growing file on human adaptability. She had initially dismissed the rumors about Deathworlder capabilities as typical frontier world braggadocio, but Morrison was proving to be a fascinating case study. The human's casual dismissal of environmental challenges that would incapacitate most species suggested that Earth's classification as a Class 10 death world might actually be conservative. Back in the training complex, Jenna had moved on to combat practice. The Academy's combat training philosophy emphasized what they called civilized warfare: energy weapons, force fields, and precise technical fighting styles that minimized physical contact. It was all very elegant, very refined, and absolutely nothing like the hand-to-hand combat training that had been drilled into her since childhood. She stood before a training dummy designed to simulate Valerian physiology, studying its crystalline structure and trying to remember the instructor's lecture about appropriate force application. The Valerians were proud of their combat traditions, viewing warfare as an art form that combined grace, precision, and overwhelming technological superiority. Their fighting style emphasized distance, control, and what they called elegant solutions to crude problems. Jenna threw a punch. The dummy exploded. Not dramatically. There was no fireball or shower of sparks. It simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure, its crystalline matrix unable to absorb the kinetic energy of what the human considered a gentle tap. Fragments scattered across the training mat, and several emergency sensors began chiming simultaneously. Warning: training equipment failure detected. Dispatching maintenance team. I barely touched it, Jenna muttered, examining her knuckles for damage. Finding none, she shrugged and moved to the next dummy. This one was designed to simulate Thrakari physiology: dense, energy-resistant hide capable of withstanding plasma bursts. She decided to try a different approach, opting for what her old drill instructor would have called a love tap to the solar plexus. The dummy folded in half. Okay, that's definitely not supposed to happen. By the time the maintenance team arrived, Jenna had worked her way through 6 different training dummies, each one representing a different alien species, and each one thoroughly defeated by increasingly gentle applications of human combat techniques. The maintenance chief, a long-suffering Grundak named Torek, surveyed the wreckage with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many equipment malfunctions in recent weeks. "Let me guess," he rumbled in his species' characteristic bass growl. "The human was here. I was trying to be careful," Jenna protested. "Is human careful or normal careful? Is there a difference?" Torgeth gestured at the scattered remains of what had once been 6 expensive training dummies. Apparently, the maintenance team went to work with practiced efficiency, while Jenna retreated to the observation deck, where other students had gathered to watch the daily spectacle of human exercise. The group included representatives from most of the Academy's species, a cluster of nervous Zephyrians who kept phase-shifting whenever Jenna looked in their direction. Several Valerians maintaining their characteristic air of crystalline superiority, and a handful of Thrakari, who seemed torn between professional interest and existential dread. "She's getting stronger," whispered Kethvar, a second-year Valerian whose family had held military positions for 17 generations. His translucent skin had taken on the deep blue hue that indicated stress, and his internal light patterns flickered erratically. "That's impossible," replied his companion Zeflos. "She's only been here 6 weeks. Physical adaptation takes cycles of training. Tell that to the training equipment." They watched in fascination as Jenna began her cool-down routine, which consisted mainly of light stretching and what appeared to be casual conversation with the maintenance team. The humans' easy camaraderie with the working-class Grundaks was another source of bewilderment for the more aristocratic students, who maintained strict social hierarchies, even in academic settings. "I heard she arm-wrestled Torg last week," Kethvar continued. "Beat him in under 30 seconds. Impossible. The Grundaks are renowned for their physical strength. He's been treating her with religious reverence ever since." Indeed, Torag had developed what could only be described as a crush on the human, though he'd vehemently deny it if asked. In his culture, physical prowess was the highest virtue, and anyone who could casually outmuscle a member of his species while maintaining perfect politeness deserved respect. The fact that she'd bought drinks for his entire crew afterward had cemented her status as a figure of near mythical proportions in the maintenance department. As the training session wound down, students began filtering back to their dormitories, but one figure remained in the observation deck. Zephyr Colthane stood with the fluid grace characteristic of high-born Valerians, his crystalline features set in an expression of aristocratic disdain. Unlike the younger students who mixed fear with fascination when observing the human, Zephyr regarded Morrison with the cold calculation of someone who viewed her success as a personal affront. The Colthane family had maintained their position in Valerian society for over 3 millennia, their name synonymous with military excellence and cultural refinement. Zephyr had arrived at the academy expecting to add another chapter to his family's legacy, perhaps even earning the coveted designation of Prime Exemplar, the highest honor available to academy graduates. Then a Deathworlder had shown up and started breaking everything. It wasn't just the training equipment, though that was irritating enough. Morrison's casual disregard for the academy's carefully structured social hierarchy threatened everything Zephyr understood about proper order. She spoke to maintenance staff as equals, showed no deference to upper-year students, and, worst of all, seemed genuinely oblivious to the complex web of species-based social expectations that governed academy life. "Barbarian," he muttered in High Valerian, his internal bioluminescence pulsing with barely contained irritation. Unfortunately for Zephyr's sense of superiority, Jenna had indeed been studying High Valerian, and her linguistic adaptation was even better than her file suggested. She glanced up at the observation deck and offered a cheerful wave. "Thanks for watching," she called out in perfectly accented High Valerian. "Hope you picked up some tips." Zephyr's bioluminescence flared bright enough to illuminate the entire observation deck, a reaction that among his species indicated either extreme embarrassment or homicidal rage. Possibly both. As he stalked away, crystalline fingers clenched into fists, Zephyr began formulating plans. The Academy's Grand Melee tournament was only weeks away, a formal competition where students could demonstrate their combat prowess in front of military recruiters and family representatives. It would be the perfect venue to remind everyone exactly what separated civilized species from Deathworld barbarians. Down in the training complex, Jenna finished her stretches and gathered her gear, blissfully unaware that she'd just made an enemy. In her experience, people who took themselves too seriously usually worked out their issues eventually. After all, how much trouble could one aristocratic alien cause? As she headed for the showers, the Academy's AI made another notation in its growing file on human behavioral patterns. The file was becoming quite extensive, filled with observations that would have profound implications for interspecies relations, if anyone bothered to read it. "Note," the AI recorded in its impassive electronic voice. "Human subject continues to exceed all baseline parameters for Deathworlder integration. Recommend immediate review of safety protocols and social interaction guidelines. Also recommend substantial upgrade to training equipment budget." In the distance, warning sirens began to wail as someone discovered that Jenna had somehow managed to crack the reinforced flooring in Complex 7. Just another typical day at Nexus Prime Academy, where the only thing more dangerous than the advanced weapons training was letting a human use the exercise equipment unsupervised. The Academy's evening meal period proceeded with its usual carefully orchestrated chaos, as hundreds of students from dozens of species attempted to navigate the complex social dynamics of interspecies dining. The cafeteria had been designed by committee, which explained why it resembled a three-dimensional maze crossed with a diplomatic reception hall. Different atmospheric zones accommodated various breathing requirements, while specialized food dispensers catered to everything from photosynthetic ethereals to the carnivorous apex hunters from the rimworlds. Jenna had found her usual spot at one of the neutral zone tables, designed for species with similar environmental needs. She'd learned to avoid the Valerian section after an unfortunate incident involving what she thought was seasoning, but turned out to be a mild neurotoxin, and the less said about her encounter with Zephyrian cuisine, the better. "Morrison!" Torset voice boomed across the cafeteria as the Grundag maintenance chief approached with his evening meal, a slab of protein that looked like it could double as body armor. "Heard you cracked the floor in 7 today. Complete accident," Jenna replied around a mouthful of what the dispensers optimistically labeled Terran Skyle nutrition paste. "I was just doing some light cardio." "Light cardio," Torque repeated, his tusks gleaming with amusement. "You know the engineering specs on that flooring? rated to withstand direct plasma cannon fire. Maybe it was defective, or maybe humans are scarier than anyone wants to admit. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Lithara, whose phase-shifted form solidified into visibility as she approached their table. The Zephyrian academic carried herself with the dignity befitting her position, though Jenna noticed she maintained a respectful distance, something most of the faculty had learned to do after the great sparring incident of week 3. "Miss Morrison," the professor began, her voice carrying the melodic quality common to her species, "I was hoping to discuss your participation in our upcoming xenobiology symposium, the one about Deathworld adaptation patterns." "Precisely. Your presence here has provided invaluable data for our research into species integration. We're particularly interested in your psychological adaptation to low-threat environments." Jenna blinked. "Lothar? Well, yes. Compared to your homeworld's environmental challenges, the Academy's training regimen must seem quite manageable." Torg snorted, nearly choking on his protein slab. "Tell that to the training equipment." Professor Lithara's phase-shifted form flickered with what might have been embarrassment. "Yes, well, we're still calibrating our understanding of human physical capabilities. Perhaps you could provide some baseline measurements for our research." "Sure," Jenna agreed. "What did you have in mind?" "Nothing too strenuous. Basic strength assessment, reflexive response testing, perhaps a demonstration of your species' combat techniques under controlled conditions." "Sounds reasonable. When do you want to start?" "How about tomorrow? We've prepared a special testing facility with upgraded safety protocols." As the professor phase-shifted away, Torg leaned closer to Jenna with a conspiratorial whisper. "You know she's been taking bets on how much damage you'll cause, right?" "Really? Smart money's on total facility replacement. I put 50 credits on interdimensional breach." Jenna laughed, unaware that across the cafeteria, Zephyra Colthane was watching their interaction with growing irritation. The Valerian noble had spent the entire meal period observing the humans' casual interactions with faculty and staff, noting how quickly she'd integrated into the Academy's social structure despite her obvious barbarism. It was all wrong. Military academies were supposed to maintain proper hierarchies, with respect flowing upward through clearly defined chains of command. Students deferred to faculty, faculty deferred to administration, and everyone maintained appropriate species-based social boundaries. Morrison's egalitarian approach to relationships threatened the very foundation of civilized society. "She's corrupting the entire institution," Zepho muttered to his dining companions, a select group of upper-year Valerians who shared his views on proper social order. "Perhaps," replied Vex Glane, a third year whose family connections had secured him a position in the Academy's student government. "But she's also bringing attention to our institution. Military recruiters from 17 systems have requested information about the human experiment." "Attention from the wrong sort of people," Zephyr countered. "Frontier worlds, colonial militias, mercenary companies. Is that really the reputation we want?" "The Terran Defense Force has also expressed interest," added Morthak, whose family served in the Valerian Diplomatic Corps. "They are apparently impressed by the Academy's progressive integration policies." Zephyr's bioluminescence pulsed with barely contained frustration. The humans were a newly contacted species, barely 50 years since first contact, and yet they were already disrupting established galactic social structures with their casual disregard for proper protocols. Worse, other species were actually adapting to accommodate them, rather than insisting they conform to civilized standards. "Mark my words," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 17 generations of military tradition, "this will not end well. Deathworlders belong on the frontier, not in institutions of higher learning." His companions nodded politely, though privately several of them were beginning to question whether Zephyr's rigid adherence to traditional values might be somewhat outdated. The galaxy was changing, new species were joining the community of civilized worlds, and perhaps some adaptation was inevitable, but none of them were brave enough to voice such heretical thoughts aloud. As the evening meal period concluded and students began filtering back to their dormitories, Jenna found herself walking alongside Kethvar, the young Valerian who'd been observing her training sessions. Unlike his older cousin Zephyr, Kethvar had developed something approaching curiosity about human capabilities. "Morrison," he ventured, his internal light patterns flickering with nervous energy, "may I ask you something?" "Sure, what's up? Is it true that your homeworld has predators that hunt sentient species?" Jenna considered the question. Define hunt. Actively stalk and consume intelligent beings as a primary food source. Not really. I mean, there are some dangerous animals, but they're more opportunistic than predatory. Sharks, bears, big cats. They'll attack humans if they're hungry or threatened, but we're not their preferred prey. Kethvar's bioluminescence dimmed with relief. That's somewhat reassuring. Of course, there are the drop bears, carnivorous marsupials that live in trees and drop on unsuspecting certains. Extremely aggressive, nearly impossible to detect, and they can crack a human skull with their bite. The young Valerian's crystalline features went pale. That sounds terrifying. Jenna maintained her serious expression for exactly 3 seconds before grinning. I'm kidding. Drop bears are a myth we use to scare tourists. Oh. Kethvar's relief was palpable. You have an unusual sense of humor. Wait until you hear about the spider season. Spider season? Every autumn, when the giant hunting spiders migrate across the continent in search of mates. The skies go dark with their numbers, and they're attracted to movement and heat signatures. This time, Kethvar was smart enough to recognize the setup. Another myth? Completely true, though they're usually only about the size of dinner plates, and they're not actually dangerous to humans. Mostly, by the time they reached the dormitory complex, Kethvar had developed a healthy appreciation for the complexity of human communication patterns. He was also beginning to understand why his cousin Zephyr found Morrison so unsettling, not because she was genuinely dangerous, but because she refused to fit into any of the established categories for understanding alien species. As they parted ways at the dormitory entrance, Kethvar found himself looking forward to tomorrow's xenobiology demonstration. Unlike Zephyr, who saw Morrison as a threat to proper order, the younger Valerian was beginning to realize that the human might represent something far more interesting, an opportunity to expand their understanding of what was possible. Behind them, unnoticed in the shadows of the dormitory complex, Zephyr Colthane finished his evening surveillance with growing determination. The Grand Melee Tournament would provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of civilized combat techniques over Deathworlder barbarism. All he needed was the right moment to issue a challenge. After all, how difficult could it be to defeat someone who didn't even understand proper fighting forms? The announcement of the Grand Melee Tournament arrived with all the pomp and circumstance that military academies seem to require for everything, including cafeteria menu changes. Commander Vextool stood at the podium in the main auditorium, his chitinous form gleaming under the ceremonial lighting, while hundreds of students from dozens of species filled the amphitheater-style seating. The Grand Melee, he buzzed with appropriate gravitas, represents the pinnacle of academic achievement. Here you will demonstrate not merely your combat prowess, but your understanding of civilized warfare principles. Jenna sat in the back row, quietly eating what the dispensers called breakfast but looked suspiciously like recycled cardboard. Around her, students whispered excitedly about the tournament's prestige, the attending military recruiters, and the substantial prize funding provided by various species defense ministries. Combat will be conducted according to standard galactic protocols, Vexthul continued. Energy dampeners will ensure non-lethal engagement, medical teams will monitor all participants, and victory conditions will be determined by our advanced AI scoring system. Professor Lithara materialized beside Jenna's seat, her phase-shifted form causing several nearby students to jump. Miss Morrison, have you considered entering the tournament? Not really, Jenna replied around a mouthful of breakfast paste. Seems like everyone else has been training for this their whole lives. Perhaps, but you've shown remarkable adaptability. Besides, the research data would be invaluable. Down on the stage, Commander Vexthul was explaining the tournament structure. Preliminary rounds would narrow the field to 16 competitors, followed by elimination brackets leading to the final championship match. Winners would receive military commendations, scholarship opportunities, and most importantly, bragging rights that could last entire careers. Registration closes at the end of this week, the commander announced. Remember, this tournament represents not just personal achievement, but the honor of your respective species. The auditorium erupted into excited chatter as students began forming training groups and discussing strategies. Jenna noticed that several conversations had suddenly gone quiet, with participants glancing in her direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright terror. I think they're worried about you entering, Professor Lizara observed. Why? I'm just a first-year student. You're also the student who accidentally destroyed 6 training dummies yesterday, cracked reinforced flooring, and somehow managed to arm wrestle a Grundak into submission. That was friendly competition. Tor is still telling anyone who'll listen that you're blessed by the machine spirits. Over the next few days, the academy buzzed with tournament preparation. Training complexes operated around the clock as students practiced their species' traditional combat forms. The Valerians worked on their crystalline blade techniques, elegant movements that combined martial artistry with technological precision. Zephyrians practiced phase-shifting combat, learning to materialize at precisely the right moment to deliver devastating attacks. Drakari's students focused on energy projection, creating elaborate light shows that doubled as lethal weapon displays. Jenna, meanwhile, continued her usual routine of accidentally breaking equipment while trying to understand alien combat philosophy. She'd registered for the tournament almost as an afterthought, mainly because Professor Litara had offered extra credit for participating in her ongoing research project. The key to Valerian combat, explained Master Instructor Sithvel during a specialized seminar, lies in the harmony between technology and technique. Our crystalline matrices amplify natural abilities while maintaining perfect control, he demonstrated with fluid grace, his translucent form shifting through a complex kata that incorporated energy manipulation, environmental adaptation, and what looked like interpretive dance. Crystalline formations erupted from the floor in response to his movements, creating temporary weapons and defensive barriers that dissolved and reformed in perfect synchronization. Beautiful, breathed several students. Jenna raised her hand. What happens if someone just punches through the crystal? The instructor's bioluminescence flickered with confusion. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Is crystalline formations. What if an opponent uses direct kinetic force instead of trying to match your energy patterns? That would be crude, inelegant. No civilized fighter would attempt such a barbaric approach. But would it work? Master Sithavel's internal light patterns shifted to indicate mild offense. Miss Morrison, Valerian combat techniques have been refined over millennia. They represent the pinnacle of civilized warfare. Sure, but I'm asking about the physics. Crystal structures have specific fracture points, right? Apply enough force at the right angle and they'll shatter, regardless of the energy matrix. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Zephyr Coltane's sharp intake of breath. The young noble had been watching the exchange with growing indignation, his aristocratic features set in an expression of barely contained outrage. Perhaps, he said, rising from his seat with fluid grace, some students would benefit from a practical demonstration of why traditional techniques have endured. Master Sithavel's mandibles clicked nervously. Mr. Coltane, I don't think I formally request a training bout with Miss Morrison. To demonstrate proper form, of course. The training hall went dead silent. Formal training requests were serious business at the academy, carrying implications that went far beyond simple sparring matches. They were typically used to resolve disputes between students of different species, and declining such a request was considered a significant loss of face. Jenna looked around the suddenly tense room, noting the mixture of excitement and horror on her classmates' faces. Sure, why not? If Master Sithavel had possessed human facial expressions, he would have been visibly sweating. Instead, his chitinous features simply twitched with barely controlled panic as he began setting up the formal sparring protocols. Energy dampeners were activated, medical teams were summoned, and the Academy's AI began recording everything for later analysis. Standard rules apply, the instructor announced, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. Victory conditions, submission, incapacitation, or judge's decision. Combat will continue until one participant yields or medical intervention is required. Zephyr moved to the center of the training mat with predatory grace, his crystalline features glowing with anticipation. This was his element, formal combat, governed by rules and traditions that favored technical skill over crude strength. He'd spent years mastering the elegant techniques of his people, learning to channel energy through crystalline matrices with surgical precision. Jenna stepped onto the mat with considerably less ceremony, rolling her shoulders to work out the kinks from sitting through the morning's lectures. She looked distinctly underdressed for formal combat, wearing standard academy training gear instead of the ceremonial equipment favored by most species. Begin when ready, Master Sithravel announced, retreating to what he hoped was a safe distance. Zephyr immediately launched into his opening sequence. a flowing combination of movements that caused crystalline spears to erupt from the training mat around Jenna's position. The technique was flawless. Textbook Valerian combat that would have impressed military instructors from here to the core worlds. Jenna sidestepped the first spear, ducked under the second, and casually snapped the third one in half with her bare hand. The training hall erupted into shocked murmurs as fragments of shattered crystal scattered across the mat. Zephyr's bioluminescence flared with surprise and indignation as his perfect technique was dismissed with what appeared to be casual contempt. "Impossible!" he breathed, reforming his crystalline weapons with increasing desperation. "Those matrices are reinforced with quantum-bonded molecular structures. Yeah, they're pretty tough," Jenna agreed, examining the crystal fragment in her hand. "But they're still just crystals." What followed could hardly be called a fight. Zephyr threw everything he had at the human. Advanced techniques that represented centuries of Valerian military tradition, energy manipulations that should have been overwhelming for any first-year student, and combat forms that had earned him recognition as one of the most promising young warriors of his generation. Jenna treated it like a particularly interesting puzzle. She didn't fight so much as adapt, studying each new technique just long enough to understand its principles before finding the most efficient way to counter it. When Zephyr created energy barriers, she found the weak points in their construction. When he launched projectile attacks, she simply moved to where they weren't. When he attempted to trap her with complex crystalline formations, she broke them with precise applications of force that turned elegant structures into expensive debris. "This is fascinating," Professor Lithara whispered to her research assistant. "Notice how she's not actually fighting him, she's deconstructing his techniques in real time." "Should we stop this?" the assistant asked nervously. "Are you insane? The data we're collecting here will revolutionize our understanding of adaptive combat psychology." By the time Master Sithafel finally called a halt to the demonstration, Zephyr was breathing heavily, his internal bioluminescence flickering erratically with exhaustion and frustration. The training mat looked like a crystal mine had exploded, littered with the fragments of his shattered techniques. Jenna, meanwhile, looked mildly winded, but otherwise unaffected by the experience. "Well," she said, offering Zephyr a hand up, "that was educational. Thanks for the demonstration." The young Valerian noble stared at her outstretched hand as if it were a venomous snake. The casual offer of assistance, the complete lack of acknowledgement for his superior breeding and training, the dismissive tone that suggested she viewed their formal combat as nothing more than a learning exercise, it was all too much. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a cold fury that made several nearby students step back involuntarily. Jenna shrugged. "Okay. Same time tomorrow?" As the training hall slowly emptied, Professor Lithara approached Jenna with barely contained excitement. "Miss Morrison, that was extraordinary. Your adaptive capabilities exceeded every projection in our models." "Thanks, I guess, though I'm not sure what I adapted to." He was telegraphing his moves pretty clearly. "Telegraphing?" "Yeah. The whole crystalline formation process takes about 3 seconds from initiation to manifestation. That's plenty of time to see what he's planning and move accordingly." The professor's phase-shifted form flickered with amazement. "You were analyzing his technique in real time?" "Well, sure. Isn't that what you're supposed to do in a fight?" As Jenna headed for the showers, leaving behind a training facility that looked like a geological disaster zone, Professor Lithara began frantically updating her research notes. The implications were staggering. Not just for xenobiology, but for military strategy, interspecies relations, and the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic civilization. Behind them, unnoticed in the shadows of the training hall, Zephyr Colthane stood among the wreckage of his family's ancient techniques, his crystalline features set in an expression of cold determination. The Grand Melee Tournament would provide a more formal venue for demonstrating Valerian superiority, with official recognition and military witnesses. This time he would not underestimate the Deathworlder's crude capabilities. This time he would end this humiliation permanently. The Grand Melee Finals arrived with enough ceremony to make a diplomatic summit jealous. The main arena had been transformed into a gladiatorial spectacle, complete with holographic displays, multi-species commentary teams, and betting pools that had somehow become an unofficial academy tradition. Military recruiters filled the VIP sections, while students packed the general seating, their excitement creating a cacophony of clicks, buzzes, chirps, and various untranslatable vocalizations. Commander Vexhul stood at the center of the arena, his ceremonial armor gleaming under the spotlights. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted sentient beings, welcome to the final match of this year's Grand Melee tournament." The crowd erupted as Zephyr Colthane made his entrance, crystalline form practically radiating aristocratic confidence. He'd spent the intervening weeks in intensive training, refining techniques that dated back to the founding of Valerian civilization. His family's ancient combat armor had been specially modified for the occasion, each crystalline plate inscribed with honor marks representing 17 generations of military excellence. Jenna's entrance was considerably less dramatic. She jogged into the arena wearing standard training gear, waving cheerfully at Torg and his maintenance crew, who'd claimed the best seats in the house. The Grundak chief held up a sign reading, "Tanks smash pretty rocks," in 5 different languages. "Our finalists represent a fascinating study in contrasts," announced Professor Lithara from the commentary booth. "Zephyr Colthane embodies centuries of refined Valerian combat tradition, while Jenna Morrison brings the unpredictable adaptability characteristic of Deathworld species." "Translation," muttered her co-commentator, a gruff Thrakari veteran named Grixtal. "The Crystal Boy's got fancy moves and the human's going to break something expensive." The preliminary rituals began with Zephyr performing the traditional Valerian Onakata, a flowing sequence of movements that demonstrated perfect harmony between warrior and weapon. Crystalline formations erupted around him in precise geometric patterns, each one dissolving and reforming in perfect synchronization with his movements. Jenna spent the same time doing jumping jacks. "Unusual warm-up technique," Professor Lithara observed diplomatically. "She's loosening up her shoulders," Grixtal replied. "Smart. Crystal Boy's got reach advantage." When the match officially began, Zephyr immediately launched into his most sophisticated technique, the prismatic convergence, a combat form that created multiple crystalline duplicates while channeling energy attacks through quantum-folded space. It was beautiful, elegant, and, according to military textbooks, completely unstoppable. Jenna watched the light show with obvious interest, head tilted like she was solving a particularly engaging math problem. When the energy beams converged on her position, she simply wasn't there anymore, having sidestepped with the casual efficiency of someone avoiding a puddle. "Fascinating adaptation speed," the professor noted. "She's treating this as a learning exercise rather than combat." Zephyr's frustration mounted as technique after technique failed to connect. The human moved with maddening efficiency, never where his attacks landed, never responding with the crude counterattacks he'd prepared for. She seemed genuinely curious about his abilities, studying each new technique with academic interest before finding its obvious weaknesses. The turning point came when Zephyr abandoned elegance for desperation. His family's honor demanded victory, his species' reputation required dominance, and his personal pride could not tolerate defeat by a barbaric Deathworlder. In a moment of crystalline clarity, he realized that traditional techniques were insufficient. He would have to get his hands dirty. The grab happened faster than most species could track. Zephyr phase-shifted through his own crystalline barriers, abandoning defensive positioning for a direct assault on Jenna's throat. It was crude, inelegant, and completely contrary to everything Valerian combat philosophy represented. It was also the worst mistake of his life. Jenna's response was pure human reflex, a textbook grapple encounter that her drill instructors had beaten into muscle memory through 10,000 repetitions. She didn't think, didn't plan, didn't consider the relative fragility of crystalline bone structure compared to human skeletal systems. She just moved. The sound that echoed through the arena defied easy description. Part crack, part crystalline chime, part structural collapse. Zephyr's collarbone, a delicate lattice of quantum-bonded crystal designed for elegance rather than impact resistance, simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The young Valerian's scream cut through the sudden silence like a thermal lance through tissue paper. "Medical emergency in the arena," the AI announced with its customary calm. "Dispatching trauma teams." Jenna stood over her opponent, looking genuinely confused. "Did I do something wrong? I thought this was supposed to be non-contact sparring." In the commentary booth, Professor Lithara was frantically updating her research notes, while Grixtal muttered something unprintable in 3 different languages. "Well," the Thrakari veteran finally said, That's definitely going in the textbooks. The arena fell silent, except for Zephyr's whimpering and the approaching sirens of emergency medical vehicles. Jenna knelt beside her opponent, her expression shifting from confusion to concern as she realized the extent of his injury. "Hey, medical's on the way," she said gently. "Try not to move too much." Zephyr looked up at her through tears of pain and humiliation, seeing not the savage Deathworlder of his imagination, but someone genuinely worried about his well-being. The realization was somehow worse than the physical agony. He had challenged a human to prove Valerian's superiority. Instead, he had learned the difference between combat as art and combat as survival. The medical bay at Nexus Prime Academy had seen its share of training injuries over the years. Energy burns, phase shift displacement syndrome, the occasional crystalline matrix overload, but nothing quite like the structural collapse of a Valerian's primary skeletal support system. Dr. Helixwin, the facility's chief medical officer, stood over Zephyr's bioregeneration pod with the expression of someone trying to solve a three-dimensional puzzle while blindfolded. "Fascinating," she murmured, her serpentine form coiling around the diagnostic displays. "The fracture pattern suggests instantaneous stress distribution across multiple quantum-bonded crystal matrices. What kind of force could cause this type of damage?" "Human," replied her assistant. A young Zephyrian nervousness kept making him flicker in and out of visibility. "Be more specific." "Home human, applied standard grappling technique. Duration, approximately 0.3 seconds. Dr. Helixwin's scale shifted to a color that indicated profound skepticism. "That's impossible. Valerian bone structure is specifically designed to withstand energy weapon discharge. No biological force could." She paused, reviewing the diagnostic data with growing amazement. The injury was surgically precise, targeting exactly the stress points that would cause maximum structural failure with minimum applied force. It was as if the human had somehow identified the most vulnerable aspects of crystalline architecture and exploited them with textbook efficiency. "Has anyone interviewed the human about her combat training?" the doctor asked. "Miss Morrison?" "She's in the waiting area. Claims it was a basic defensive maneuver and keeps asking if Mr. Colthane will be okay." Down the corridor, Jenna sat in what the Academy generously called a waiting room, but more closely resembled an alien furniture exhibition. Chairs designed for species with vastly different anatomies created a seating arrangement that defied both logic and comfort. She'd eventually given up trying to find something human-appropriate and settled for leaning against a wall. Commander Vexthul approached with the measured gait of someone delivering either very good news or very bad news. His mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement as he settled into a nearby chair designed for something with entirely too many joints. "Miss Morrison," he began, "we need to discuss what happened in the arena. Is Zephyr going to be okay? I didn't mean to hurt him that badly. He'll recover. Valerian medical technology is quite advanced, though it will require several weeks of regenerative therapy." The commander paused, studying her expression with his compound eyes. "The question is whether you used excessive force." Jenna blinked. "Excessive force?" He grabbed my throat. "Yes. We've reviewed the recording. Mr. Colthane clearly initiated inappropriate physical contact. Then I responded appropriately. Basic defensive grappling. Redirect the attacker's momentum. Control their center of gravity. Apply leverage at the weakest structural point." "Weakest structural point?" "Sure. Valerian bone structure is beautiful, but it's optimized for energy distribution, not impact resistance. The collarbone joint is particularly vulnerable because it has to balance flexibility with load-bearing capacity." Commander Vexthul's mandibles clicked faster. "You analyzed his skeletal structure during combat." "Not consciously. It's just basic anatomy. You learn to read bone density and joint flexibility when you're training in mixed species environments." "Mixed species environments," Jenna shrugged. "Earth got a lot of biodiversity. You learn to adapt your techniques depending on whether you're dealing with something built like a gorilla or something built like a deer." The implications of this casual statement were staggering. Commander Vexthul had spent decades studying military tactics from across the galaxy, and the idea that human combat training routinely included adaptive techniques for multiple body types suggested a level of versatility that most species never encountered. "Ms. Morrison," he said carefully, "exactly how much restraint were you using during the match?" "All of it? I mean, this was supposed to be a demonstration bout, right? I was trying not to hurt anybody." The commander's compound eyes focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. Are you telling me that you deliberately held back during the tournament? Well, yeah. I'm not here to injure people, just to learn. Besides, Zephyr's techniques were actually pretty interesting from a physics standpoint. Before Commander Vexthul could process this revelation fully, Professor Lithara materialized beside them in a shimmer of phase-shifted energy. Her usual academic composure had been replaced by barely contained excitement. "Miss Morrison," she began breathlessly, "I've been analyzing the tournament footage, and the applications for military training are extraordinary. Your adaptive combat methodology could revolutionize interspecies tactical doctrine." "I don't have a methodology," Jenna protested. "I just do what seems logical." "Exactly. That's what makes it so remarkable. While other species train in rigid combat forms optimized for their physiology, humans apparently develop flexible approaches that can be modified in real time." Commander Vexthul's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, which among his species indicated either deep contemplation or system overload. "Professor, are you suggesting that human combat training is fundamentally different from standard galactic military doctrine?" "Not just different, superior. At least in terms of adaptability." Professor Lithara's phase-shifted form flickered with academic enthusiasm. "Most species develop combat techniques based on their natural advantages. Valerians use crystalline manipulation, Zephyrians exploit phase-shifting, Thrakari rely on energy projection." "Makes sense," Jenna agreed. "Use what evolution gave you." "But humans," the professor continued, "humans don't have any obvious natural advantages. So instead you developed techniques for fighting everything else." The waiting room fell silent as the implications sank in. Commander Vexthul found himself reconsidering decades of assumptions about military training and species specialization. If humans routinely trained to fight opponents with different physiologies, different advantages, different natural weapons, then they were essentially learning to counter every possible combat style simultaneously. This explains so much. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Helix Wind, whose serpentine form moved with the fluid grace of someone bearing significant news. "Mr. Colthane is stable," she announced. "The regenerative therapy is proceeding normally, though he's requested to speak with Ms. Morrison." "Is that safe?" Professor Lithara asked. "Physically, yes. Psychologically?" The doctor's scales shifted to indicate uncertainty. "He's been through a humbling experience. Some perspective adjustment may be inevitable." Zephyr's recovery room had been designed with Valerian physiology in mind. Crystalline surfaces that resonated with his species' natural frequencies, carefully calibrated lighting that enhanced their bioluminescent communication, and atmospheric processors that maintained optimal humidity for crystalline bone regeneration. The young noble looked smaller somehow, his aristocratic bearing diminished by medical equipment and the visible scaffolding supporting his reconstructed collarbone. His internal bioluminescence pulsed weakly as Jenna entered, and his expression carried none of its former arrogance. "Morrison," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Jenna pulled up a chair designed for something with more legs than humans typically possessed. "For what?" "For underestimating you. For assuming that strength meant barbarism." He paused, his crystalline features shifting with obvious discomfort. "For grabbing your throat like a common thug." "That wasn't great technique," Jenna agreed diplomatically. "My family has maintained military traditions for over 3 millennia, Zephyr continued, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "We pride ourselves on honor, discipline, and civilized conduct. Yet when faced with defeat, I abandoned everything I was taught and resorted to crude violence. Everyone makes mistakes when they're frustrated, but you didn't." His bioluminescence flared briefly. "Even when I attacked you directly, your response was controlled, precise, measured. You could have seriously injured me, but you used exactly the force necessary to end the threat." Jenna considered this. "I guess. Though I still feel bad about the collarbone thing. Don't. It was an educational experience." Zephyr's expression shifted to something approaching humility. "I spent weeks studying your combat techniques, trying to find weaknesses to exploit, but I was approaching it all wrong." "How so?" "I was looking for ways to defeat human barbarism. I should have been trying to understand human restraint." Over the following weeks, word of the tournament spread throughout the academy and beyond. Military recruiters who had initially dismissed human applicants began requesting detailed reports on Deathworlder training methodologies. Academic institutions started developing exchange programs with Terran military academies. Most significantly, the academy's curriculum began incorporating what they tactfully called adaptive combat principles, though everyone knew they meant human-style fighting. Commander Vexthul found himself fielding inquiries from military commanders across 17 star systems, all wanting to know more about species that could train for combat against unknown opponents. The strategic implications were staggering. While other militaries specialized in fighting specific types of enemies, humans were apparently training to fight everyone. Professor Lithara published her research to considerable academic acclaim, though she was careful to emphasize that human combat effectiveness stemmed from necessity rather than natural aggression. Growing up on a world filled with dangerous creatures had forced humanity to develop flexible survival strategies that translated remarkably well to interspecies conflict. Jenna, meanwhile, continued her studies with characteristic obliviousness to the minor revolution her presence had triggered. She attended classes, accidentally broke training equipment, and maintained her friendly relationships with maintenance staff and faculty alike. The only real change was that other students had stopped treating her like a curiosity and started asking for combat training advice, which she was happy to provide, though she insisted on starting with basic safety protocols. Rule 1, she explained to a group of eager first-year students, never grab someone's throat unless you're prepared for them to break something important. Like what? Asked Kethvar, who had become something of a human combat enthusiast since his cousin's enlightening experience. Like your collarbone, your pride, or your fundamental assumptions about civilized warfare. The irony was not lost on Academy instructors that the barbaric Deathworlder had become their most popular teacher of restraint and tactical discipline. But then, as Commander Vexthul had learned to appreciate, humans seemed to specialize in defying expectations. In the end, Zephricalthane's family maintained their military tradition, though with a significantly expanded definition of what constituted civilized conduct. The Grand Melee Tournament continued its annual tradition, though with substantially upgraded medical facilities and revised safety protocols specifically addressing Deathworlder participation. And deep in the Academy's archives, filed under Species Integration Studies, Professor Lithara's research gathered digital dust alongside thousands of other academic papers. None of the military strategists who requested copies bothered to read her conclusion, which noted that humanity's greatest tactical advantage wasn't their adaptability, their physical capabilities, or their creative approach to problem-solving. It was their consistent refusal to be as dangerous as everyone assumed they were. After all, in a galaxy full of species trying to prove their superiority through violence, the real revolutionaries were the ones who proved their strength through restraint.